Hello, welcome again to another episode on Talk Architecture Podcast. Your host, Naziaty Mohd Yaacob, with you on today's episode, where I will discuss the continuing part 3 on is the architecture culture in an office, a club. As I promised, I want to define what that a club means. And it's very simple. From the last episode where I used quotes from a Facebook group discussion on the boys club or the architecture club, or assertion that there is such a thing. And the discussion led to the architecture culture in one of the comments by the members of the Facebook group. So I really appreciate that person's in-depth comment where she mentioned about the team members and how the team members would look out for each other. If somebody is sick, then the others will have to take the load, for example. But when you start thinking about this in a bigger picture of work-life balance, you would see that it is a system. The architecture culture is a system of how it works. The system has been proven to be effective from the perspective of the directors or the company owner, in a way that they see the results. But what are the cause of the results in the long run to the individual and the company? Do we see the individual sticking to the company for a longer time? Do we see a decline in productivity in the company? These questions have not been qualified or quantified by the company. It is just assumed because everybody is busy anyway. So when we refer back to that quote or that comment on the architecture culture exists, how does it exist? I sort of went around to find out more and not really focusing on architecture practice, but just in general about work-life balance with reference to 3 ways to achieve work-life balance by Ashley Willens, a TED Talk that I watched. I got some notes down, and then this particular topic for today is the new culture that respects time. It's a subtopic more than anything else. When we think about the architecture culture, where the perception of time revolve around there is not enough time, there are deadlines, and you need to keep to the deadlines, and you need to commit to the deadlines, and the client says Monday morning or Monday afternoon where you have to spend, that's a deadline, and you have to spend the weekend to complete for that deadline, and you would do so without asking questions. But maybe you did ask questions. Maybe you did ask the question, can it be later because I would like to spend time with my family this weekend? And then there could be a guilt factor factored in. Maybe that person has had a me time or a weekend off before, and I'm just going around with this scenario where the director would say, but you did have that time a couple of weeks ago, so we really need you this time, or whatever it is that could play on the guilt. That is the operative word for today, the guilt, because it is about relationships. Picture 5 people working in their cubicles at work, and they are part of a team, and they have a work relationship. Like any relationships, there are all these factors about how people would interact with each other. Maybe they are not really wanting to be someone who is taking advantage of others. Maybe they see it as what the company expects. So that sort of policy that says that is embedded in the architecture, culture, and the system of how it works, how the architecture company works. So the system says you gotta work extra hours. So it's written in the job description that you cannot claim for overtime and you have to work extra hours, because it is believed that in architecture, you just do the extra time. Because in architecture culture that had started in architecture schools, working overtime is just a given or something that you expect to do. And when you enter the profession or do architecture practice, you are expected to give up these hours. Now, the thing is, there will be this tug of war between the director or the bosses who believe in so and the employee. But that's the way how it works. So that becomes a negative point or minus points in your key performance indicators if you do not wish to comply to that policy. So eventually you will sort of give up because you're not getting promoted as well as the others are and giving the remunerations, although you did your job to the best of your ability. So all these gray areas and how things work is part of the system in which it is a lot to do with relationships. If the architecture culture calls for looking out for one another in a 5 to 15 people team members, and that guilt is the way one makes others work, there is something wrong with the system that was created. Can there be a culture that respects time? So back to the topic, the subtopic of today, which I stated earlier. Could there be a new culture that respects time? Because the perception of time, as I mentioned it just now, that we all know and take for granted. I myself know and take for granted, even way back then in the 1990s, when I first started out after part 2, that it is just when it's expected by the bosses or the directors that you work beyond the regular time, and you're paid the same amount of money, no doubt. You're fixed. Your salary is fixed. Just say at that time was 2,000 ringgit. So there is no way that you're going to earn more, even though you put in time, because you feel guilty that you're not able to work extra time, like what I had gone through in the first episode. I was mentioning about my example. So that is the way time is perceived. But can there be a new culture, a new architecture culture that respects time? So Ashley Willens explained further about leisure activities that we should be doing, which helps us with our stress and make us happier. Yeah. So when we want to do these leisure activities in the weekend or after office hours during the weekdays, and we don't get these leisure activities, there are costs to this. This always on culture, quote unquote, by Ashley Willens also mentioned, which I use as architecture culture in this respect. Costs to the business and costs to the individuals, where they get more stress and burnout and they are less happy. So leisure time, when we are in a shopping mall with our family or in a cafe or having dinner, and then we text messages to the director to still be working at that time. We can't concentrate on what is happening. Just say we go to the museum with the children in the weekend, and we're so occupied with texting the messages that is related to work that leisure time is not really being felt good. It makes us feel guilty that we have to attend to the director or the associate, and at the same time we are attending to the children and ourselves. So it is unfair that we feel guilty in both counts. So that's why there is stresses and burnout happening. So unfulfilled in that way, unsatisfied in that way, how do we change perceptions with regard to time? So Ashley Willens, this is not something from architecture practice or architecture culture, but from someone who is a psychologist, and it is how she would give advice based on her book. I think it's Time Break or Time Out, something like that. I'll try to go and dig that out later and explain better. But anyway, you can find her in the TED Talk. So she reframed rest. Rest is essential for anyone. So one of the things is treating weekends like a holiday. Is staying at home, but you treat it as if you're in a holiday so that you can be more relaxed. It is more, what is happening is that, of course, definitely there is clear boundaries where you need to set. I'm not going to take calls after a certain time. So, and also you set team goals with your team. We're all going to be with our families after this time and not going to talk about work. So then, later, this is something that needs to be backed up by the directors of the company. The directors of the company has this policy that they support this. The perception of time and how the perception of work-life balance and why rest is important to make in the long-term productivity to happen. And it would also make the employees happier. So the directors also need to buck up, meaning that if the client said Monday morning or Monday to submit the work, why not ask for a longer extension on Tuesday or Wednesday, so that you are addressing a serious thing at hand, the rest of your team members. The team members getting enough rest so that they can be more productive. So they rest during that weekend and then they'll be fresh for the next week on Monday. So that was the clear suggestions given in general. But what else could you be giving suggestions specifically for architecture culture? Something that I would like to find out, and hence the research on architecture culture as part of this is something very important in determining work-life balance for architects, reducing the stress and burnout. To me, the architecture culture, it doesn't mean a boys' club per se, but it meant more about how the system works. Discrimination and gender discrimination especially is something that have to be dealt with in a different way, and it's more complicated in my opinion. But in general, the architecture culture, where we redefine what is time to the company and to the employees, and they won't have to feel guilty about saying no or setting clear boundaries, is very, very important for the health and mentality of architecture staff. So that is like in a nutshell, the conclusion to what is this club mentality. Now, the interesting thing is how this has started in architecture school. It's like chicken and egg, actually. Don't know. Architecture practice is a chicken, and architecture education is an egg. Where does it come first? So, if through architecture practice there emerge architecture education or the architecture schools, then how independent is the architecture school in creating the curriculum and implementing it in terms of the biasness and how it is being conducted. So I'm at the corner with the belief that architecture students do not need to go and spend extra time on their work. And the Malaysian Qualification Agency, and probably similar qualification framework that has been done in other countries, I would assume that recognizes that the students should have proper rest times, and that the student learning time should not exceed a certain time. And, when you say 7 hours a day, that's it, really. And that's indicated in the credit system. How many credits should be given to a subject is detailed out in the curriculum pro forma, they call it. Yeah. So if that's true, what is reflected in the pro forma or the curriculum is happening and implemented in architecture schools, then there is no way you would force students to do work over the time limit. It's up to the student, really, whether they want to do work extra. That is entirely up to them, but maybe there could be a strong suggestion for them to do other things, involved with other things outside of school hours, to have that rest, enough rest, at least that, and to have enough occupation of learning other things. May it be hobbies or learning other subjects like reading, fiction or non-fiction, or other discipline that's not architecture that one would like to engage in, to be that holistic person, the all-round person that one would like architects to be. That broad-based education is related to that, actually, and that argument as well. So there you can see clearly that the architecture culture and architecture practice do influence how people think that architects should be trained in architecture schools. That's very clearly seen, but it is good that we have this qualification agency or framework that says no, students should have more time for themselves. Excuse me. For themselves and rest. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for listening, and that is about it, really. The part 3 is a conclusion on the subtopic on a new culture that respects time to change the architecture culture that is perceived to be something that is born through an understanding of what architecture, how architects work, which may not be the one that is helping in the work-life balance.